Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here, the host of the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And today's episode is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group, where we create, document, and implement processes and procedures so businesses can grow and thrive. And today's guest is another Adi Vaxman. Hi, Adi.
Hey, hi, Adi.
Hello. I think, I had another podcast when I interviewed another Adi, and it was Adi Kalkavachian, but she spelled it more, she says it Adi. So it was also the Adi and Adi show, but this is the Adi and Adi show. So I'm so excited to have you here, not because we have the same name, not only because we are both into operations, right? And we love processes and procedures.
Yes, definitely geeking out over processes.
Geeking out on over processes. But let me first of all introduce you, because you're so amazing, Adi, like what you do. And I'm going to give you a bio, okay? So people will understand why I'm saying that. So you are the founder and CEO of Sheba Consulting, which is a fractional leadership services practice out of New Jersey. You're an experienced leader with over 30 years of experience. And you having filled C-level roles in startups and mature companies alike. So you're definitely an entrepreneur, you experienced it all. So when you now give advice to businesses, you're coming from a point that you have done it, you know how to do it, and you're sharing your experience, right?
Definitely.
You specialize in growing and scaling organizations, managing change processes, implementing digital transformations, building teams, and creating thriving organizational cultures, both hybrid and remote. Now, we both have in common, we grew up in Israel. That's why we have the same name, because it's an Israeli name. We moved here over 25 years ago. And, you were working in the tech industry for nearly 20 years before starting your own business in 2009. And you love everything that has to do with technology, right? It's part of you.
Absolutely.
Yes. And a fun fact, you are married, you have 3 kids, five cats and 1 dog.
5 cats and a dog.
5 cats and a dog. It's amazing. And you hold 2 business Bachelor of Science degrees from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And you have an MBA and a PhD from Cornell University. So as I said, well-rounded, a lot of experience. So you don't just have the academics, you have the experience, the rolling up your sleeves and do it yourself. And now you're definitely helping small, medium-sized businesses succeed. And we're going to have like a whole conversation here about processes and about what are the key components to help a business succeed. You also publish articles, you're being interviewed to podcasts. So a lot to talk about. Anything that I left out in terms of the bio?
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay, good. So let's start a little bit just talking about yourself. I know I introduced you in the bio, but tell me a little bit more about Sheba Consulting.
Cool. So Sheba Consulting is a fractional leadership practice. We support small and medium businesses, so anywhere within from 1 million to 25 million in revenues, although we've had much larger, not really much smaller. This is kind of our sweet spot. We provide fractional leadership services. So we do fractional COO, fractional CHRO, and fractional CTO. We also provide supporting services in back office operations, HR, recruiting, and administration to our clients. And so we've been around since 2009, 14 years this year. So it's been a while.
That's congratulations. First of all, right there, congratulations and well done. 14 years in business, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's been a while. I didn't do this full time in the beginning. The first few years, kind of did it on the side as a side business. A lot of mostly Israeli tech firms came to me because they knew me and I was from the industry, as they wanted to kind of expand into the US market. and I helped them set up shop here. So for a few years, I kind of did fractional on the side while I was also employed full-time for other tech companies. And at some point, I started my own startup in 2014, raised a whole bunch of money, made a mistake with how much power I gave investors, very kind of newbie mistake in the startup world, and startup failed after 2 years. And at that point, I took the company full-time, hired a team, expanded, and started providing these services full-time. And we are now 10 people. And still growing, and really, really love what we do.
That's fantastic. That is so cool. Let's talk for a second before we dive into basically we're going to talk about the growth inhibitors of small and medium-sized businesses today. But before that, let's talk about fractional leadership, right? You mentioned that's what you do. I had a great interview a few podcasts ago with Joseph Rossi, who's all about yourcmo.com. It's all about fractional leadership and the importance of it. And I had definitely several other guests that talked about it. It is definitely, it's a change, right? I mean, it's a change in the last few years. It's getting more and more common, more acceptable. In your own words and what's your opinion? Why do you feel like fractional leadership has benefits? What are the benefits of the fractional leadership?
So fractional leadership is really helpful for companies that are going through growth for several reasons. The first of these reasons is that in order to go through a change, any change, major change, you usually need different kind of leadership, different kind of experience than you do to manage something that's, pretty static or growing very slowly. So to go through what I call a growth spurt in a company's life, when they go through rapid growth, you need different types of experience in your leadership team. You need someone that has had a lot of experience and has done that multiple times. And that's very hard to find. So one thing, it's really hard to find. Another thing, it's really expensive. And you don't necessarily need that person on long term. You need that person on to lead you through a change process. And in most cases, in the company sizes that we deal with, you also don't need that person full time. And in fact, I've worked for companies much larger, all the way up to 250 million in revenue. And even those larger companies don't necessarily need a C-level executive full time. When I was doing full-time roles for larger companies, I found myself doing 80% of my time was spent doing things that more junior people could do with the right guidance. And so if you have the team that you can guide and knows how you work, then you don't really need to invest 100% of the time. And so in recent years, fractional leadership has gained a lot of traction. I would say that when we first started, it was a lot more common to see fractional CFOs. They weren't called fractionals, they were called outsource at the time, but the idea is the same idea, except the model changed a little bit. And then after that, it was fractional CMOs. But the field has expanded in recent years to fractional chief revenue officers and fractional COOs, and certainly in the HR world. And so this is what we do, and also fractional CTOs. So our company provides COO, CTO, and CHRO. These are the areas that we excel in and that we know how to provide help to companies with. The benefits are twofold, kind of. I think one side of the benefit is just purely financial. For the cost, for what you can afford to buy, you can get someone a lot more experienced with a lot more ability to lead you through a change process than you can at a full-time, at a full-time rate. So that's one thing. Secondly, if you really need that person with that kind of experience and that level of knowledge, you won't be able to afford them full-time. You just won't. Usually these companies that are, with revenues anywhere from 1 to 25 million or even to 50 million, they're not going to be able to afford someone for 500 and 600,000 a year. And that's the minimum that it's going to cost to get someone at that level. Right. So that's the pure benefit. It's the first benefit is just financial benefit for a cost of someone, maybe director level, maybe a little over director level. You will get someone with the level of experience. That's one benefit. Another benefit is that when you do fractional as a career, rather than a lot of people do fractional as a side thing, like between jobs or kind of consulting gigs. But when you do fractional as a career, you get exposed to dozens and sometimes hundreds of businesses that are going through the same processes and they're going through the same growth. And so as someone who has done this thing for so many companies, the level of experience and the knowledge that I gain in 1 year working with 5 or 10 businesses that are going through growth is equivalent to maybe 10 years in a career. And so,
I so agree with you. I just had a client today, that we are documenting their processes, and they're in the HVAC, the heating and cooling contractor and business. And, I've done so many of those that when she mentioned something, I just had the answer because I've seen how it's being done in so many other companies, right? So I agree with you. That's definitely, there is the cost benefit, but there is also for that cost, which also, it's a benefit, because for that cost, you're getting so much experience, and you're getting so much maturity and experience and ability to solve problems faster because of the experience of that person. So I agree with you 100%. So that's, and, especially in the areas that you specialize in terms of operations, IT, HR, you see things and you gain that intellectual knowledge that then you can actually provide to other companies. So I agree. That's definitely
absolutely. So I think it's a really win-win model for many, many companies. They get to experience leadership at a level that they can't usually find or afford at an affordable price. And there's also another benefit that's usually not spoken of so much, but with a full-time employee, you have a different relationship as a business owner or as a CEO. You have a different relationship than when you do with an outside partner. An outside partner can really be a partner. An employee would always have a little bit of a conflict of interest because they want to stay there. They want some job security there. And there's a bit of a, sort of like an authority and boss and employee relationship that you will not have with an outside provider. And so taking all of these political and emotional pieces, putting them aside, that really brings into the partnership a level of sincerity and trust and directness that you can't always get with an employee, or is going to be very hard to get with an employee. So we tell our clients the truth no matter what. So regardless of whether it's going to be good for us or bad for us, because that is not why we're there. We are there to give clients value. And that value sometimes needs to be communicated with, and they need to know things that they don't necessarily want to hear. And an employee is not always going to tell you because they're put in an impossible position.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree 100%. Okay, good. So that's definitely why we need a fractional, and I agree with you. So now let's talk about the growth in inhibitors of a small to medium-sized businesses, right? Yep. We had, and I know you identified 5 pillars of growth, right? Or growth inhibitors. So obviously we can look at it from the positive or the negative, but if you don't have that, those pillars will inhibit a business from growing. And those are also the pillars that you go and address with businesses, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Good. So the first one is teams. So teams, tell me about, when our listeners are listening to teams, I think they can think about okay, so how can teams inhibit the growth? Well, if you don't have the right people in the right seat, right? If you don't have people, if you don't know who to hire, etc. But I'm curious to hear from you, what are the main inhibitors that you see in a business that when it has to do with teams?
Yeah. All right. So yes, like you said, there are 5 areas that we normally see. And I'll just kind of preface that with something, is that most of our clients come to us when they already have a problem, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't like that, because if you plan ahead for the growth and you put in the infrastructure on time before you have a problem, then it's cheaper, it's faster, it's a lot easier to handle. But unfortunately, most of our clients come to us when they already have some kind of major problem to solve. And those problems usually revolve around one of these 5 areas that we talked about. And teams is probably the first one. So teams can be, like you said, having the wrong people in the wrong seats. So even having the wrong seats to begin with, right? Defining what it is that your organization needs in order to reach the goals of growth, that the growth goals that you want it to reach. You need to decide what seats those are, what levels of experience, what management team, what does your structure look like? And then having the wrong people in those seats, which brings me to the next point, such as holding on to the wrong people. A lot of organizations came a certain way, they reached a certain growth, and they have people that are like families to them, especially when you're, small business growing. You have this emotional attachment to the people that brought you so far, but sometimes it hinders your ability to see that that person can't take you to the next step. It doesn't mean that they can't stick around. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't, but they're not necessarily the person to grow with you. Sometimes it's possible, and sometimes these people remain, like their learning, their ability, their experience, their learning curve remains here. Well, you're already here, and like you're way ahead of the game, and these people can't help you grow. So the wrong people in the wrong seat could also mean holding on to people from your past that can't really fill the roles that you need them to fill to help you grow.
Absolutely. I think, Adi, one of the questions to ask now that I'm listening to you and I'm thinking is like, if I were to hire today, would I hire that person? Right?
Yeah.
Because
that's very difficult. It's difficult for business owners to even put themselves in that place because they have such an emotional bond and attachment to that person.
Right. I mean, it's also loyalty. So of course.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Second point on the inhibitors is the structure. I guess lack of structure or not having a structure, right?
Yeah. So organizational structure is always one of the first things that we either identify or address in growing companies, right? So one of the things that I see repeating again and again and again is there are no roles and responsibilities, or the roles and responsibilities are not clearly defined, they are not documented, they are not communicated well to the people, and therefore there's no accountability. So if something is everybody's job, then it's nobody's job. And although a lot of company and business owners are like, we love this camaraderie spirit of, everybody being responsible for everything and everybody pitches in, when you're growing, it doesn't work anymore. And the reason why it doesn't work anymore is that people need very clear responsibilities in order to be accountable for their results. And if something, if you trust everybody to do something, who do you then go to, and who do you then hold accountable when that something isn't done or isn't done well? Nobody.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that can definitely be a big inhibitor. It's that point of responsibility. Let's talk about the third one, which is systems. And you know how much I love systems, you love systems. Explain your concept of systems and why lack of systems inhibits businesses from growing.
So actually, it's both lack of systems or too many systems in my experience. So what we're seeing in clients that are coming through the door is that that's probably the majority of clients, they don't have any systems in place. They are functioning like, all paper, maybe some Excel sheets, a million documents, something like that. That's like their idea of like progress and everything electronic. Or they are doing.
I'm going to stop you right there, because what I think is those are systems, but I guess
to some extent
systems, so efficient system, right? Because my theory, and correct me if you think otherwise, but everything is a system. Even if you have like the most convoluted way of doing something, that's your system of doing it, right?
Yes. So we're looking at, so like I said, there's two types of clients. One that either have very basic systems or none at all and are doing everything manually. And those that have way too many systems and are drowning in systems and processes that are not communicating with one another and are not really getting the benefit of the data that is in all of these systems. And so there's one side that's like analysis paralysis. People are overanalyzing what to put in. They end up doing nothing. Or those that are so in a race to put in a bunch of information systems into their organization that they put in too many, and they're not thinking about how these systems are communicating with one another and what is really the end result that you're looking to get out of them. And so the first thing that we do when we look at this as a whole is we look at what areas of system does your organization need in order to get to where it needs to be, in order to work efficiently and get to where it needs to be, that will support the growth, that will support existing process, that will support existing sales, and allow you to grow, and why, right? And that question is hardly ever asked, like, what do you mean, what areas? We need everything. We need a CRM, and we need an HRIS, and we need and not necessarily that's not necessarily the case. Every organization is different, and every organization needs to prioritize the areas that they need covered in order to sustain the growth and the why. And that's, one area. And of course, we talked about the too many systems versus no systems at all kind of conundrum. And that's also somewhere where we need to slam on the brakes at some point and say, one, you're not going to analyze every existing system on the market until you reach a decision, because it's going to take you 10 years. And by then your company's, not going to succeed because the CEO is busy analyzing 500 systems.
Well, and those systems are not going to be relevant anymore because they change so fast.
Yes,
too.
Correct. So we're going to decide on the fields and the areas that we need to systemize. And then we're going to decide on 3 to 5 max systems that we are going to check. And then we're going to do a very kind of overall, almost superficial analysis of features, cost, and benefit. And then we're going to probably deep test 2 systems. And then we're going to make a decision. And this process has a time frame, and this process has, defined goals, and the process has the metrics of what do we need to get out of the system for us to be happy with it.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a question, Adi. So you mentioned that, we can't systematize everything, and I agree with you. And when when you are talking about systems, it's basically, we're talking about IT systems, right? Like technology systems.
Tech stack, yes, information systems.
Information systems. It's not necessarily just like a system of filing or system of doing something manually. It's a system that we use technology, we use automation in order to help us. How do you decide what are the most important areas to systematize? Like what is your logic behind it when you go into a company, let's say they don't have systems, or even if they have too many and we have to cut down, so it's not that analysis, well, it's an analysis paralysis, but it's the opposite. It's like, too much overwhelm that basically nobody uses things. So how do you make a decision?
So the first thing we need to do is make a decision on what areas we are addressing, right? And there are many areas in an organization that you want to systematize, and it could be anywhere from your HR to your internal training to your, even payroll and benefits, all the way up to your CRMs and your ERPs and your accounting system and your project and task management systems and your time tracking systems. And so there's so many different types of systems out there. And what we need to look at is what is the business of this organization? Where are the main pain points and gaps that they have, right? What are the problems that they are seeing? The problems that they're seeing usually stem from something. And, if we dig deep enough, we find out what that something is. And that something could be something stupid like lack of training. Or that something could be systems that haven't been implemented correctly and people did not adapt them, and the process and the workflow was not correctly defined and explained to the organization. Or it could be, we had one client that their issue was that the phone was ringing off the hook. And at the end of the day, we found out that it's really their customer support and scheduling system that needed the work. The phone was just, one symptom of the problem. So when we dig enough, we find out what the actual problem is. Now, in most cases, it's not usually one problem. There's usually several problems in several areas that we want to address and implement systems in. And we just prioritize them. And the way to prioritize them is according to the impact. It's 2 things. It's obviously cost. That's always kind of an overarching thing. But normally the cost is pretty much the same for most of these things, unless you go all the way up to some, Oracle or SAP systems or something like that. But if you're looking at SaaS and the cost is more or less the same, then you look at the impact, right? What is the most major problem? How quickly can we alleviate, not necessarily resolve right away, but how quickly can we alleviate this problem using a system? And then we look at two factors. We look at one, how fast it's going to be to implement and alleviate the problem. Two, what is going to be the impact on the client, whether it's on the bottom line, the money, whether it's on customer satisfaction, whether it's on, just financial visibility, dashboard visibility, KPIs to the owners, any tools, analytics and insights that are guiding business decisions. So we decide what the impact is going to be for each one of those systems. And according to that impact, we end up prioritizing which one to implement first.
That makes sense, totally. So it's prioritizing and analyzing, and that's why, people need the help, businesses need the help in order to figure out how can systems actually benefit them as opposed to being hindrance, right? So the other hindrance to growth is metrics, lack of, right? If people are basically flying blind and they don't have metrics. And I would probably ask you, if people have also too many metrics and they're measuring everything, right?
Yeah, that's true. But in most of the cases that we see, we help businesses go from this mindset of no metrics, mom and pop, small business mindset to a metrics-based management approach. So we have seen, but not too many cases of too many metrics that are completely irrelevant. We've had a client for a couple of years that we ended with late last year that was doing that and was collecting all the data manually from a million different places and spending hours and hours on a daily basis collecting data that was not relevant to inform business decisions. Just because, they were very obsessed with, we got to know everything. And then we started narrowing those down. But in most cases, the number one, hindrance to growth is that small business mindset. You are still working based on your gut feelings. And I'm not downplaying intuition, because I think intuition is very important in business. But you have to be able to set some parameters for yourself. What is success? And even monitor very basic things like profitability. So many businesses work with just looking at revenue, and they're not looking at profitability at all. Your revenue is meaningless if you're spending more than you're making.
Right.
And many businesses don't even realize that their margins are so low until you actually put in the systems and you start counting, and you start showing them the numbers. And so it's that mindset. And then it's transforming the mindset and the culture of the organization to live according to a metrics-based approach. And a lot of people don't necessarily like that. A lot of people feel like it's minimizing their impact or sabotaging their management or things like that. And that's also a change process by itself, because no, we're not trying to to kind of undercut you. We're trying to give you a tool to help you manage right and to help you see whether what you're doing is working or not. And that starts by defining those KPIs, right? So you have to define what those metrics are that you're following in order to understand how your business is doing. And for every business, it's different.
100%. Yeah. It's kind of like the analogy of, you're kind of like flying blind. It's like driving without a dashboard, right? Without knowing what how fast you're going, where you're going, no navigator, nothing, right? So I completely agree that is definitely hindrance to growth not to have those.
Yeah.
Last one, processes. Let's talk about the last one, which is processes. So how can processes, in your opinion, from your experience, can hinder the growth of businesses?
So process ties all of the things that we talked about together, right? Like your KPIs, right? Their KPIs are meaningless on their own. You have to have a process and a system, and the right people in the right places in order to get to those KPIs, in order to have the metrics available, right? If the system is capable of showing them to you, but the data isn't entered in a way that's going to spit out what you needed to spit out, then it's meaningless, right? So all of these things by themselves in silo are meaningless. The process ties it all together. And the processes really defines everything from which system to use, how to use the system, what workflows to use, which person is responsible for what. The process defines the roles and responsibilities. The process defines how to use those systems. The process defines how often we monitor the KPIs, how often the data gets updated. What do we do when our KPIs are off the mark? And so without the process, everything else falls apart. So it's great to have all these other pillars, but process really ties it together. Process is something that has to be repeatable, and you can't reinvent the wheel over and over and over. So literally in my world, whenever something needs to get done more than once, that's a time to start documenting a process. And process is something dynamic. It's a living, breathing entity. It doesn't stop when you're done documenting it, because you documented it after you've done it once or twice. And on the third time, you have a different scenario that wasn't documented, and that needs to get into the process, because on the fourth time, we might need to deal with it again. So process is a living and breathing entity, and they have to be clear. They have to rely on very objective criteria and not bias, not feelings, not, I think I did this right, I think I didn't do it right. They're there for us to be able to avoid mistakes, to avoid overlooking things, to avoid dropping important aspects or steps of a workflow. If we're following a process, if the process is well documented, so the process is supported by the right systems, then our chances of making a mistake that's going to be very expensive are much, much lower.
Absolutely. Adi, what would be some of your recommendations to make sure that the processes are being followed by all?
So first of all, it has to be documented. It has to be documented. It has to be documented well. It has to be explained and trained. It has to be easy to follow. So it doesn't need to be something that, you need to have, a PhD on so that you're able to follow it. People should be able to follow process, so it needs to be intuitive. If a process is not being adopted in the organization after you've done all those things and you've trained and you've implemented and you onboarded and you're monitoring, then something's wrong with the process and we need to rethink the process and change it. Process saves time, they create accountability, and so you need to help people in the organization understand why this process is good for them, not just good for the company, because process is also good for people. Mm-hmm. And think about, our everyday lives. Like I use a million processes in my personal life as well, because otherwise I just forget things and I drop things. And my process is there to make sure that I'm on top of everything I need to be on top of, and I don't forget and I don't drop, and I know my deadlines, and I know I can monitor whenever something is out of whack, when something is not working the way that it's supposed to work. I know when that happens in time to fix it, and not when it's already a big disaster. And so I think training and really just talking about process and explaining to people in the organization is very critical. The other aspect that's so critical, in my opinion, is to allow the people that are working in the organization day in, day out to be a part of the creation of the process.
I agree, because otherwise, you brought a great point. You said about getting the buy-in. So you get a buy-in why it is important for the people in the organization to have the process, but it's also the buy-in comes from they take ownership and they have that participation, because otherwise they feel like they are not included, right? It's the processes that they do day in and day out, especially if you, let's say, grow a business and you start the process documentation project. When the process is already established, you can't just exclude those people. So I think you're spot on in terms of including everybody, make it inclusive, make them participate, make them give you the input, because then there will be a better adoption of the entire process.
Yes, that's very important, as well as showing them and demonstrating to them how it's going to save them time. It's going to make them happier, because they're not going to be stressing out about things, and they're not going to get berated for things that they forgot. And so we come into a lot of organizations, and, a lot of times I hear when I first come in, oh, I'm having a problem with this and this person. They always make mistakes. And so usually I say, I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to listen because I'm going to look at the people, look at the processes and understand what's going on. In most cases, it's not the person. In most cases, the issue is that there is a flaw in the process. There's a flaw in the workflow that is making it way too easy for people to make mistakes. Right. And I'm not saying that we can avoid mistakes 100% because we're all human. It's not possible. But the more we can automate, the more we can safeguard, the more checks and balances we can create to make sure that those mistakes don't happen, then our employees' lives are also easier and they're happier because they're not stressing over, okay, like, what mistake am I going to make next that someone's going to yell at me for? Or someone's going to be upset with me about. And so we don't want to give those opportunities, life, really. We want to close those loops.
Absolutely. And it comes back to the first point of teams. If you have the right team in place, you also have to have the right processes in place in order for it to be a win-win situation and get people to win, that you, like the people that you selected, and actually the right people, you have to have the right systems, the right people, measure them correctly with the right metrics, have the right structure. So I completely agree with you that those 5 pillars are all encompassing and create the great organization that people want. So, yeah. Right?
Definitely. And I wish that more business owners would kind of jump on this before they have a major problem to solve.
Absolutely. All right. So if people want to get a hold of you, Adi, what's the best way?
So getting a hold of me is easy. It's adi@shebaconsulting.com, and our website is Sheba Consulting, SHEBA Consulting.com. We are on LinkedIn. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. We even have a nice AI chatbot on our website that goes directly into our team Slack. So we are very accessible. And we'd love to hear from any business owners that could benefit from the value that we provide.
Absolutely. So I highly recommend that you contact Adi. On the show notes, you will also have all this information. And Adi, I really want to thank you for being a guest on this podcast and sharing all this knowledge. I'm sure our listeners benefited from it a lot, and it gave them the idea of what they need in order to have a successful business. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Adi, and hope to be here again.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.